But what I want to talk about today is a book that relates to the area where you folks are from and the place that you love, Little Traverse. It's a story of Native Americans in the Midwest region. And that's where northern Michigan, uh, the northern part of the lower peninsula and the upper peninsula, they're different than almost everywhere else in the Great Lakes states, in that there is an indigenous native population there living in their homelands. But for the majority of the Midwest, we live in uh, the shadow of an ethnic cleansing that completely removed all of the native people from their homelands in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and large sections of Wisconsin and lower Michigan. And so the native story of the Midwest is something that uh, almost haunts the region. It should haunt the region. Uh, and I think it's only in the last few years that people have begun to appreciate the fact that we've built these cities, we've built these industries and suburbs uh, upon the lands of a people who were so sorely treated. The story that I'm telling today is different than that story because it's a story of how Native people were able to maintain their presence in uh, the Midwest region. Uh, and I want to go ahead and send out a thank you to Jane Cardinal, who of course, lives up in Little Traverse area. Her wonderful art uh, was something that helped me visualize this subject, and she was generous enough to let me use this picture on the cover of the book. Now, I came to this subject as a public historian. In my career at Loyola University in Chicago, my job is to train students to work at historical societies like Little Traverse, um, to work at museums, national parks, doing historical interpretation for the public. And all of my research is something that grows out of working with these kinds of organizations or federal agencies. So I've written 10 books, but all the books have come out of public history projects. And this particular book about Andrew Blackbird had its origin when I was solicited to be an expert witness in 1998 in the case of the United States versus Michigan. There had been an earlier case in the 1970s, United States versus Michigan, that established the rights of the Odawa and Ojibwa on the Great Lakes. The 1998 case was involved with to what extent do current native populations in Michigan have a right to hunt and fish out on the lands that were ceded in 1836 outside of state regulation. In the course of doing that research, one of the main questions that an historian has to answer is how did the native people at the time in which the treaties were negotiated understand its provisions? What was their view of what was happening at the time? Uh, and this is a very difficult task because almost all the sources that we have are sources written by European Americans. There is very little, even when we have a record of a treaty and native spokesmen are quoted, uh, that is coming through the filter of the European American scribe at the treaty. So I was thrilled to be able to find uh, the book written by Andrew Blackbird that I think most people up in Little Traverse are familiar with, The History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan. Because here was a volume about the history of the Odawa written by a member of the tribe. That is an extremely unique thing, particularly because Andrew Blackbird was living through the most tumultuous time in the history of the Odawa people. And he was one of the signers of the 1855 treaty with the United States. And so it was through his work that I was introduced into the land of the crooked tree, and was very impressed to read about through it from Andrew Blackbird's account of this continuous village that existed for 15 miles along the shore of Little Traverse Bay, but also to then read in the archives of the National Archives the correspondence of petitions that were sent by the Native people of Little Traverse to the federal government, trying to negotiate with that powerful foreign agency. And you know, anytime you're doing research like this, you always want to go out and see the places where history happened. It's very important in bringing the subject alive in the mind of the writer. And so I made a number of trips, of course, up to the Little Traverse area, but I always remember the first one I did. And after doing some research in Petoskey, in county records, I'm at county records, I went ahead and went up to Harbor Springs for the first time and did some research there. And then I went up the famous, Tunnel of Trees. And I was anxious to see Cross Village and to see where Middle Village had been. And when I got to where Middle Village was there, some of you know, of course, there is this very colorful, very, very interesting general store. But that's really all there is. At least that's what I thought on the surface. And so after buying a pop, I got back in my car, but then I noticed a little 2-track road that went kind of back, looked like toward the lake and through the trees. So I went ahead and went down it, and sure enough, began to see some old buildings of what had been Middle Village. But what really struck me was this beautiful white clapboard church rising out of the forest, and the cemetery next to it. And it surprised me as I walked up to the church, and I got out of the car, walked up to the church was actually open. There was like nobody here. This is like it seems to me, for Chicagoan, the middle of nowhere, and the door's open. I mean, in Chicago, they lock the church doors as soon as Mass is over. But I walked in, it was this beautiful little church, and I saw it was the Church of St. Ignatius. Now, I work for Loyola University, and St. Ignatius obviously plays a big role at Loyola University. My whole career, I was educated at Loyola University, and I've been teaching there for over 40 years now. And so it seemed like a certain serendipity to come across this church. And as I walked through the cemetery, I began to think that who's buried here? And I thought that many of these, because this church, it says inside the church vestibule, that this church was built on the location of the original Jesuit mission from the 18th century and from the first mission church in the early 19th century when the Catholic Church came back. So I thought, these graves must be from many of the native converts to the church, the very people that I had been reading about in the federal records and in Andrew Blackbird's book. So this moved me very much. And in thinking about it, I walked sort of over the ridge. And here's an historic picture of Middle Village. Over to the lake. And I sat down on the lake shore, just kind of thinking, trying to absorb what I'd seen. And as I sat there for a while, at one point I put my hand down in the sand and I touched a black feather. And it was kind of spooky because it's like, is this a blackbird feather? And I still have that feather to this day. And at that point, I thought, I've got to tell this person's story. He's done a marvelous job of capturing the story of his family and a moment in the life of the Odawa people. But I want to see what else I can find out about this individual historically. And that was the origin of writing this book. That was the long version. One of the things that's very striking in reading and researching Andrew Blackbird is the degree to which his life illustrates the ability of the Odawa to move so fluidly across the landscape of the Great Lakes region. These great inland seas of ours were an indigenous highway. So Andrew Blackbird had relatives among the Odawa along Lake Erie and in the Detroit area. He had an uncle who lived on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. He had another uncle who lived down in the Chicago area. And his father, in his youth, traveled all the way to Quebec, where he received some education from a Catholic mission there, and then later into the Lake Superior region, and then following the chain of lakes westward far into Manitoba, where he worked in the fur trade. And so the term Odawa, the name Odawa, means to trade. And the Odawa used the Great Lakes to expand their subsistence and commerce throughout that region. They were also hunters and fishermen. And along the shores of Little Traverse Bay, in particular, the land of the crooked tree, was extensively cultivated by the Odawa. And all along the shore in the 19th century, you would have seen their canoes, which they used to set gill nets to harvest lake trout and whitefish. Their agriculture was so successful that for generations, the French fortification at Michilimackinac, and then later the English garrison on Mackinac Island, they were sustained almost entirely by grain grown by the women of the Odawa tribe at L'Arbre Croche. The Odawa in particular, and the Odawa, of course, are part of the Anishinaabe people, which they share with the Potawatomi and the Ojibwa. We're very careful to go ahead and use their power to protect their homeland, but in a very savvy way. They tended to use their ability to travel long distances with their canoes to engage and oppose their enemies far from their homeland. So throughout the French and Indian Wars, Odawa warriors were critical to the efforts to keep the English colonies confined behind the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. And then after the creation of the United States, the Odawa still went ahead and used that ability to project military power into the Ohio Valley. And it was there that they fought very successfully against the expansion of the United States government into the area we now know as the Midwest. In 1791, in fact, they inflicted the greatest defeat, along with, they had Shawnee and Miami Indian allies, but the Odawa inflicted the greatest defeat ever on the United States Army by Native peoples. This battle had so much ignominy attached to it for the Americans that it never really got a name. In the history books, they call it, well, St. Clair's defeat. But in this battle, more than 1,000 American regular soldiers and militia were killed by a successful Indian attack. However, their resistance to the Americans culminated in the War of 1812, when they were part of Tecumseh's Pan-Indian Alliance, which was the last real effort to restrain the growth of the American Republic by the native people. So they had been successful in opposing the Americans for decades, but that ended in 1815. A significant player in these wars were Andrew Blackbird's father, a man by the name of Meketapensi, and his uncle, who was known as Asiganak. Both of those names translate roughly into Blackbird or Black Hawk. But they were warriors, and to their utmost tried to oppose the Americans. And if you go to the Canadian Museum of Civilization, there's a fantastic artifact there that was crafted at the end of the War of 1812 by Andrew Blackbird's uncle, Jean-Baptiste Asiganak. And you can see it in the slide here. This was carved by Asiganak, and he accurately tried to capture the faces, the dress of a group of warriors, friends of his, who went on what was really the last Odawa war party against the United States. In 1814, as the War of 1812 is drawing to a close, they get into a canoe like the one pictured here, and they travel down Lake Michigan, up the St. Joseph River, into Indiana, down the Wabash, and then in far southern Indiana, they ambushed a group of American soldiers, killed several of them, captured one. They brought him back after this long journey. They bring them back to the British garrison at Mackinac Island, and the garrison commander tells them the war's over. Peace has been declared. And that last war party was immortalized in this. And this artifact is part of this, the remarkable documentation there is for the family of Andrew Blackbird, even before he began to write his history. So that was the end of military resistance against the United States. And it is in the wake of that war that Andrew Blackbird is born. Like many Native people of his generation, he really did not know when the exact year in which he was born. But it was probably sometime between 1818 and 1821. So I think roughly, let's say 1820. And he was among the last group of Odawa to grow up in sort of the traditional lifestyle. He grew up making these long journeys down Lake Michigan, sometimes as far as the Chicago area. Every winter, he would go with his father and mother and brothers and sister to the father's hunting camp. They would journey from Little Traverse Bay down to the Au River, and then take that river deep into central Michigan, into what's now Mecosta County, Michigan, where they had their winter hunting camp. Then in the spring, they would move closer to the lake where there would be sugar groves, and they would make maple sugar. And then finally, when summer came, they would take their canoes back up to La Arbe Croche village on the shores of Little Traverse, where they would plant their corn crops and live in large multifamily lodges throughout the summer. This was very true for generations and generations. The Odawa had lived this way. And Andrew Blackbird is in the last generation that has this experience of a fully indigenous lifestyle. It's at this same time that the Americans now, feeling they have the military upper hand after the War of 1812, begin to put cultural pressure on the Odawa. The Odawa had been in contact with European peoples for a long period of time prior to this. For over 150 years, they'd been in contact with Europeans, but there hadn't been really a concerted attempt to change their way of life. That changes. In 1820, Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass visits L'Arbe Croche village, and he brings with him the Reverend Jedediah Morris, who has been sent by Congress to go ahead and with a message for the Indians of the Great Lakes. And that message is, you must adopt our civilization. And in a very belligerent, even rude speech to the Odawa, Morris makes this point. He says, you have to accept our missionaries, you have to change your lifestyle, you have to give up going to hunting camps, you have to become farmers. He didn't know that they were farmers already, but he closes his speech with the words, you must embrace civilization or ruin. And so, faced with this kind of challenge, the Odawa play a very clever game with the Americans. Americans say you must accept missionaries. So the United States government sends a Presbyterian missionary to Mackinac Island. And the Odawa refuse to have much contact with them. What they've done in the meantime is reach out to the Catholic Church. Andrew Blackbird's father, Nicodebensi, writes a letter to the Pope in Rome requesting Jesuit missionaries. Now, why do they do this? And I think there's several things, of course, going on here. On one hand, they are intermarried with a number of the French-Canadian fur traders in Mackinac Island, who are sort of nominal Catholics. Also, Catholics, the Jesuits, had sent missionaries there in the 17th century and were there through part of the 18th century. They didn't make many converts, but they seemed a lot less obnoxious than this Reverend Jedediah Morris. And the Catholics were Christian, but they were a suspect minority in the United States, which was a majority Protestant country. So by going this route, the Odawa are able to choose a type of Christianity that is somewhat familiar, but also is far away in Rome. That's a lot further than Washington, D.C. And they see it as a way in which to be able to control the process of change. As I said, Jesuits had been there before, but the last of the Jesuits left about 1760. And so now we're talking 1820, you're talking, a half century has gone by. So there's not a lot of people left alive who were impacted by, but there was a memory of the Jesuits being there. Well, the Catholic Church is very far away, and it is a minority religion in America. And so the word comes back, the Pope Pope gets the message. He goes ahead and communicates to the Catholic bishop furthest west, which is Bishop Fenwick in Cincinnati. And Bishop Fenwick says, hey, I got nobody to send up to northern Michigan. And so what happens is the Odawa begin a process of self-evangelization. Two Odawa men, when they were young, when they were boys, had been sent to a Catholic mission near Montreal, Lake of the Two Mountains, it was known. And that was Maccabebensi, Andrew Blackbird's father, and his uncle, Asiganak. They had studied for a time at this mission, and they learned the script that the priests had developed to actually, it's called a syllabary, to write the Odawa language. And Maccabebensi had learned this. He learned how to read the Anishinaabe language. And so they built a chapel right near where the Church of St. Ignatius in Goodhart is today. They built a birch bark chapel, and they teach people hymns and songs. And they continue to send correspondence to the Catholic bishop in Cincinnati. Now, not all Odawa are crazy about this. In fact, it's a fairly small minority that are being aggressive in adopting Catholicism. Many people are just going to figure maybe this guy Jedediah Morris and the Americans won't come back, and I'm just going to do what I want to do. And so they continue with traditional practice and lifestyle. But those who are becoming Catholic are breaking with certain traditions of respecting the spirits. And so what they do is they create a new village, because this will then be less offensive to from people who don't want to become Christian. And so they move from Middle Village down the shores of Little Traverse to create new L'Arbre Croche, which of course later becomes Harbor Springs. Finally, in 1829, the Catholic Church responds, and they send missionaries to the new L'Arbre Croche, or to Harbor Springs. One of them is Frederick Barga, who eventually becomes sort of known as the snowshoe priest, and mainly for his missionary activities along in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Lake Superior. But he does go ahead and set up a school in Harbor Springs, and through his influence, a number of young Odawa are recruited to be fully educated in the Catholic Church. And Andrew Blackbird's older brother, William Blackbird, is selected for that. And his sister, Margaret, is selected for that. And his cousin is selected for that as well. And they all go to Cincinnati. In fact, they actually go to Cincinnati before Barraga arrives. And Barraga is very famous for developing the dictionary that is critical to the modern understanding of the Odawa language. And he is instructed in the Odawa language by William Blackbird, by Andrew Blackbird's brother. While this is going on, Andrew Blackbird's too young to participate in any of this, but he does go to the local parish school that's created in Harbor Springs. Baraga is one of a whole series of missionaries. This is a crazy thing about the Catholic Church. Yeah, there's not many Catholics in America, and they don't have a big presence. And so in order to evangelize Catholicism, the church sends priests from Europe. And in particular, there's an organization called the Leopoldine Foundation. And this is set up by the Emperor of Austria, Francis II, to perpetuate the memory of his daughter, Maria Leopoldine, who was the Empress of Brazil, of all things. So what we have happen in the end is a group of Slovenian priests are sent to northern Michigan. Father Francois Piers really devotes himself for many years to L'Arbre Croche, or to the mission at Harbor Springs. And this kind of, again, is sort of the strange thing that happens with this missionary activity, is that these priests know Latin, of course. Being Slovenian, they know Slovenian. Because Slovenia is part of the Austrian Empire, they know German. And because of the work of Baraga and others, they make a strong study of learning Anishinaabe language. What they don't know much of is English. And so in the schools, they're teaching young Odawa children to read and write and to sing hymns in the language of the native people, not so much in English. 1832 is an important date for Andrew Blackbird. At this point, his brother has been away for a couple of years, first studying in Cincinnati, and then later he's so proficient in his understanding of English and that he'd teach him Latin, and they sent him to Rome, where he is instructed to become a priest. And right on the eve of his ordination, he dies. There seems to have been an accident where he is actually kind of run over by a carriage wheel in the crowded streets of Rome. But that this happens so far from home, and that word comes back from first Rome to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Michigan, in fragmentary manner, that Blackbird's father, Mecca Debensi, believes that somehow his son was murdered. And so the Blackbird family, certainly Mecca Debensi and then his younger son Andrew, they kind of break away from the Catholic Church. And it is at this moment that and they don't break away immediately, but gradually they become estranged from the Catholic Church. But it's at this very same time that President Andrew Jackson is really pushing the Indian removal policy that will eventually see its most famous manifestation in the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee, and then many of the other so-called civilized tribes of the southeastern United States, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. But this whole process is also being put into place in the Midwest, and the Shawnee, and the Miami, the Kickapoo, the Sauk, and the Fox are also being sent west, and a large chunk of the Potawatomi as well. And even some of the Odawa living in the southern parts of Michigan. And so uh, this creates, really strong feelings of anxiety among all the remaining Indian people in the Great Lakes region. And when 1836 happens, now it is the Ojibwa and the Odawa who are in the crosshairs of American expansion. And they are pushed into making a treaty with the United States. Now, they're willing to do this because they want to establish basically a nation-to-nation relationship with with the leader of the United States government, the president. Now, they don't fully understand what a bad guy Andrew Jackson is as far as Native America is concerned. They're thinking that he could be like the French father or the British father. That's the term they use to describe the leaders of those nations who they'd always had fairly cordial relations with. They're hoping to get that from the Americans, but they don't. In the end, they signed the Treaty of Washington in 1836, in which they cede, you can see in yellow on the slide to the left, of 14 million acres. And they receive in return 12 cents an acre in annuity payments, money to be paid out over several years to them. And they are guaranteed a series of reservations. And this would be a big chunk of land down near Manistee for the Little River Odawa, a big chunk of land for the Ojibwa and Odawa around Grand Traverse Bay, and then a similar tract of land in what's now Emmett County, Michigan, along Little Traverse Bay. They think they've got these reservations in perpetuity because that's what was agreed to in Washington. But when they went back home, the United States Senate, behind their backs, amended the treaty, as the Senate has the right to do. And they said they've only got those reservations for a limited amount of time. For 5 years, in fact, the treaty said. And then they've got to go west. This is not fully understood by the Odawa until it's time to ratify the treaty that's been amended by the Senate a year later. And so thousands of Native people gathered at Mackinac Island, and they're told you got to sign the treaty. Well, they did. A number of the very significant leaders of the Odawa and Ojibwa signed the treaty. But what the Odawa were thinking is, okay, let's use the money we get from these annuities to buy the land of the reservation. And then we'll have a private property right, a civil right to stay, regardless of what the United States government says. So this is kind of their strategy of accepting what is a very harsh treaty otherwise. And so, Andrew Blackbird's still, young kid. He's coming into his adolescent years now. And this is the world he's coming into, where his people have ceded the majority of Western Michigan. They've got these reservations, but it's unsure how long they'll be able to stay on the reservation. And they're waiting for the federal government surveys to come up so they can actually begin to then buy the land. They can't buy the land until the government's willing to sell the land. A terrible thing happens to Andrew at this point. His mother dies. And he really becomes adrift to a large extent. And so he takes a number of jobs. He gets on a Great Lakes schooner for a while and works as a sailor, works harvesting some fields in Green Bay for a while. But for 4 years, he takes the job as assistant blacksmith at a Protestant mission in the Grand Traverse region, where he's actually paid to become learn to be a blacksmith, to be the assistant to a white blacksmith, whom the government is paying to provide these services for the Native people. Now, most of the people who live here are in this area are Ojibwa. And they kind of take exception to the fact that it's an Odawa who's got this plum position of learning to become a blacksmith. So he's oftentimes getting criticized for being there. After doing that for a number of years, and he sees this Protestant mission community, and he occasionally goes to services there, but he doesn't become an accepted member in the communion of the Mission Point Protestant mission there. But he is attracted to the Protestant approach to Christianity. And he resolves in 1845 to resign his post as assistant blacksmith, take some of the money he's got now, and buy a steamship ticket to go to Ohio. Because along the way, he's met a missionary from Ohio who told him that if you ever come to Ohio, I'll make sure you get a good education where you can actually learn to read and write English. And so in a very bold manner, he makes this journey by steamboat to Cleveland, gets off in the bustling wharf in Cleveland, and begins to walk inland. And after a day's walking, he comes to the town of Twinsburg, Ohio, which is still there, a suburb of Cleveland. And he's looking around the town, and in the town square, he sees a bunch of kids playing. And he's kind of intimidated, doesn't want to walk up to them, but he kind of just watches for a while until finally one of the boys comes up to him and says, "Well, who are you? What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm going further into Ohio to look for Reverend Cole, who's going to get me educated." And the kid says to him, "Well, you don't want to go any further because in Twinsburg here, we got like the best school in all of Northern Ohio. You want to stay here. Here, let me introduce you to the man who runs the school." And so Andrew was then introduced to Reverend Samuel Bissell, who was in charge of the Twinsburg Academy. And Bissell becomes his lifelong mentor and friend. Bissell gets him a job to work as a blacksmith to pay for his schooling. And so Andrew goes in the morning and works like as a blacksmith till like 10 o'clock, and then he goes to school, and he's able to live with the blacksmith's place. But during the summers, for 2 years, Andrew Blackbird and Samuel Bissell make these long journeys into the eastern United States. They go to Washington, D.C., they go to Philadelphia, they go to Newark, New Jersey, go to New York City. And wherever they go, they're going to Presbyterian congregations. And Samuel Bissell is saying, look at this very earnest, young Indian man who's interested in getting an education. He's made this long journey. He's working hard to pay for his education. Why don't you donate money and support his education and the education of other young Odawa and Ojibwa boys from northern Michigan? And so in the course of doing this, they published this pamphlet, as you can see here, The Education of an Indian Youth, the appeal of A.J. Blackbird. But what's critical about this broadens Andrew's horizons. He sees the whole of the United States, really, on these trips. Now, this photograph, you see it to the right here, is of an unnamed missionary and native acolyte. I don't believe it's actually Andrew Blackbird in person. This kind of education that Andrew Blackbird gets from the mission school at Twinsburg, Ohio, serves him in great stead, particularly after Michigan revises its state constitution in 1850, and it contains a clause that says men of Indian descent not members of a tribe, may become citizens of the state and vote. Nobody knows what this means. If you look at the state constitutional convention, it's pretty clear this was meant for mixed-blooded residents of Mackinac Island community. But the Odawa hear about this, and they send Andrew Blackbird, because he knows English and he's traveled in the white man's world. They sent him on a long snowshoe, in the middle of winter, snowshoe journey from Little Traverse to Detroit. In Detroit, he tracks down the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court and puts to him the question, does this mean that the Odawa people can become citizens of Michigan? And the Chief Justice says yes. And Andrew asks him, will we lose our annuities from the federal government? And the Chief Justice says no. He then goes to the state legislature, where he meets with the governor of Michigan and a number of legislators, and receives the same assurance that this government will recognize the Odawa as citizens. And to back this up, the state of Michigan passes, the legislature passes a resolution to the United States Congress that the Native people remaining in Michigan can become citizens, and that the federal government should secure for them permanent reservations. So this is very significant for the Native people. And this happens because of the advocacy of Andrew Blackbird. Following the success of that, Blackbird has to drop out of the school in Twinsburg. Excuse me. He has to drop out of the school in Twinsburg because his father's ill, and calls him home. But eventually, Andrew is going to go to back to east to the Detroit area, where he attends the Michigan State Normal College, which is now Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. He goes there with the goal of becoming a medical doctor, because he thinks this would be of most use to his people. But unfortunately, he's forced to drop out of the school after 2 years. When he comes home, he's got a surprise for his father and for his brothers and sisters. Andrew Blackbird comes home with a wife, an English woman by the name of Elizabeth Martha Fisk. He describes her to Samuel Bissell as a very beautiful young English woman, a well-educated woman who is willing to take all to a good heart, what adversities we may meet during our lives, and willing to take hold in trying to enlighten my nation. Andrew gives up on being a physician because he thinks he and his wife can come back to Little Traverse and become teachers and bring the kind of education that he had gotten at Twinsburg right there to people in Little Traverse. And he knows this is going to be way better than the Catholic school because they're going to teach everybody English and they're going to learn more than the Catholic hymnal. Upon his return, Andrew was also able to get involved in stopping the removal process. This is something that very much grows out of that resolution that the Michigan legislature had sent to Congress, saying you got to come up with a permanent solution for the Indians here because we're willing to make them citizens. And so that leads to a new round of treaty making, and that's the 1855 Treaty of Detroit. in which removal is no longer the policy. Instead, money is provided by the government to set up a network of schools, the kind of schools that Andrew wanted for Native people, and then technical assistance to help them adapt their economy. In the wake of this, Emmett County is organized, and it's organized largely with Odawa in the leadership roles. An Odawa man as the sheriff, Odawa on the county board, Odawa tax collectors. Most of the basic functions are being cared for by Odawa, and these tend to be Odawa who, like Andrew Blackbird, in the wake of Andrew Blackbird, had gone to Twinsburg for several years to learn to read and write English. It's at this time also that the Odawa begin to adapt their economy. They're continuing to farm, but they're putting more emphasis on market products such as maple sugar and especially fish. And they begin to transition from canoes now to the Mackinac boats. And many of the Mackinac boats, early Mackinac boats, are made by Indians, and nobody really knows the full origin of the Mackinac boat, which becomes the dominant boat on Lake Michigan for almost a generation. To what extent it's a design that's influenced by Native ingenuity. All this time, Andrew is advocating for education. He has an editorial in the Detroit Tribune, in which he writes, "We now wish to become men of knowledge and education, that we may hold an equal standing with our white brothers, since we have abandoned our laws, manners, and customs, having renounced our chieftainships, under the most solemn declaration to uphold the government of the United States as directed by the President, the head chief of the nation." And what he wants is to be able to become a teacher in these schools. And he wants these schools to teach the students the skills of liberal arts. Unfortunately, the Indian agency in Michigan that administers the schools is through a practice that goes back quite a ways. The United States government always made the Indian agent for Michigan a Methodist minister. And Andrew Black and those ministers tended to be Democrats. And Andrew Blackbird, when he had gone west with Reverend Bissell, was kind of converted to becoming anti-slavery. And as the Republican Party begins to take hold after 1854, Andrew Blackbird is a Republican. And so these Democrats who are running the Indian agency won't give him a position as teacher, and neither he or his wife can become teachers. So he's frustrated. He does work with a couple of Protestant missions, not Methodist ones, but he's somewhat frustrated. That ends, however, with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And in 1860, with the Republicans in the White House, with the Republicans controlling the Congress, Andrew Blackbird is elevated now to become the U.S. interpreter for the Odawa people. And this is a much more important job than just being an interpreter. The Indian agent for Michigan is based in Detroit. And he travels to Indian communities once a year in the summer. The rest of the time, there is no federal presence among the Native people except for the indigenous interpreter. That's Andrew Blackbird. So he's the one who's actually providing the agent with all the knowledge necessary to write reports about what's happening to the Native people in Michigan. In this role, Andrew, of course, the Civil War breaks out following Lincoln's election. Andrew Blackbird plays a very significant role in helping to recruit Odawa and Ojibwa men to join the Union Army. And they form a particular unit, the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. And you can see the monument that's located today in Lansing at the Michigan State Capitol to these soldiers who fought very valiantly in the last 2 years of the war. The photograph to the left is one of those individuals, Payson Wolf, who had been captured during the Petersburg campaign and suffered through an awful incarceration in the hellhole of the Andersonville prison. It's really after the Civil War that northern Michigan begins a dynamic change, and a change that's not going to work for the better for Native people. This is really what Andrew Blackbird called the Troubles. This is when Michigan undergoes what you could call the green gold rush, in which more money is made cutting and selling the timber of Michigan's forests than of the whole entire California gold rush. And Andrew Blackbird is like the principal representative of Indians to the white government in Michigan, and he is sort of a spokesman for Native people who aren't capable of really dealing with the emerging new land system in Michigan. According to the 1855 treaty that Andrew Blackbird had been one of the signatories for, a reservation was created, in some ways recreated, because there had been an earlier one from 1836, but a reservation was made of lands in what's now Emmett County, and the federal government agents, the Indian agents, were supposed to go ahead and provide the head of every household with a tract of land. Then the remaining land would be made available for anybody to buy who wanted it. Unfortunately, these Indian agents might have been better Methodist ministers than they were business people, because they completely made a botch of the allotment process. One agent would start the allotment process, and then he would be replaced, and the land that he had given away, that tract book would be lost, and so they would start over again. And Odawa were just confused, because this process went on from 1855 into the 1870s. And it's really not until 1872 that most of the allotments are made. But by this time, there's a whole new generation. You go almost 20 years, there's a whole new group of people who are heads of Odawa households, and according to the treaty, have a right to an allotment of land, to an allotment of 80 acres. But the government, these people aren't on the lists that were made back in 1855. So there's a controversy. And what eventually happens is that, and Andrew Blackbird is constantly writing to Washington to get this situation sorted out. And eventually, the Native people are forced into a compromise, which is basically engineered by some clever business people and government people down in the Grand Rapids area, that this area that had been reserved in Emmett County for Native allotments will be open to homestead claims, but will let the new household owners in Michigan claim homesteads. Well, getting a deed to your land from the United States government, as was intended in the 1855 treaty, is very different than being allowed to file a homestead claim. Homestead claims require that you build a residence on that land and that you live on that residence for 5 years before you can then have that awarded to you as your land. And many of these homesteads that were given to the new generation of Odawa household heads were lost. And this is all what goes back to the recent litigation that's taken place in federal court about the Odawa reservation. Was the reservation ever ended? I don't want to get into that, but we got a different story. Because the story I want to tell is how Andrew Blackbird tried to defend these Odawa homesteaders. For example, one of the cases that he participated in, and here's the account that was sent to Washington. In the fall of 1876, one of the Odawa homesteaders, a woman, was absent from her house for 10 days. While so absent, her house was forcibly entered by a certain white man who took possession of the house, took all of her furniture and possessions out of the house, and then took over and made it his house. When the Indian woman came back, he threatened to shoot her if she came anywhere near the house. When she came back to collect her belongings, he threatened to chop her up into little pieces. Andrew helps this woman get a hearing in court. But this was a very difficult process for Native people. Andrew knew English and could talk in front of the court, but in many cases, you had these whites who were trying to take over Indian homesteads. They were in cahoots with the General Land Office staff, who for a couple of bucks would go ahead and make the white person the just claimant to the property. In other cases, Native people were intimidated by the fear that if they lost their case, they might be forced to pay the court costs, which they couldn't do. And so the courts and the government General Land Office all participated in what was a pretty sleazy business of taking land from relatively uneducated people. Andrew Blackbird's lobbying was and his sister's lobbying. She actually went to Washington. Margaret Boyd, his sister, actually went to Washington. They eventually were able to get federal investigators from the Department of Interior to come and condemn what was going on. But by that time, a population change was taking place in Emmett County, in which Native people were no longer the majority. And then other means were adopted to begin to push natives off their land. So, for example, taxes were raised on certain properties so that it became difficult for Native people to raise enough cash to pay the tax money, the property tax money, to maintain their lands. During this time, in addition to being the Indian interpreter, Andrew Blackbird was also the postmaster for Little Traverse, for Harbor Springs. And at one point, people are upset that he's doing this out of his house. So he takes some of his money from the government as an interpreter and builds a post office. But no sooner does that happen than he is stripped of his postmastership. And it's very hurtful for him when he is told by a number of white people, we don't want any more Indian PMs or postmasters. And this becomes a general sort of pushing of Native people. No longer are Native people participating on the county board, no more Native sheriffs. uh, as you get a flood of white people coming in, making claims to the land, and driving the native people off. In his latter years, Andrew becomes very disappointed with what has happened, with his inability to help his people as much as he wanted. He also becomes somewhat alienated from them. Certainly, the fact that he has this white wife, this English woman, she's able increasingly to build a social network with other white women living in Harbor Springs. And she doesn't associate with Native women. Most of the Native Christians are either Catholic or Methodist. Andrew, always being a little bit of a maverick, he becomes Episcopalian in his latter years. And then when he finally loses his position as interpreter and is barred, he's very close to being named the Indian agent for Michigan when, without any warning, the Michigan Indian Agency is abolished. And so he's kind of pretty much left to his own devices. He tries to begin maybe like a speaking career where he's going to use his education to be able to talk about the history and traditions of the Odawa, but that doesn't really prove to be too successful. However, there is an opportunity because in addition to the lumber industry thriving in northern Michigan, as railroads begin to push their way northward, northern Michigan becomes a vacation haven for people in the lower Midwest. And all along the shores of Lake Michigan are formed resorts, or sometimes what they call achu clubs, where people suffering from hay fever, there's no antihistamines in those days, people suffering from hay fever would often go stay for several months on the shores of the lake. Religious communities, of course, begin to establish some of the resorts, as you folks well know. And so this creates this sort of new niche for the Odawa, many of whom have lost their land. For Odawa men, it's an opportunity for them to use their skills gained from subsistence hunting and fishing as guides. For Odawa women, they're able to go ahead and marshal the magnificent skills, artistic skills they had in weaving baskets and the quill work to manufacture souvenirs for tourists, as these Odawa women have spread their wares on Mackinac Island and waiting for customers to arrive. Blackbird sees an audience in all these visitors, and so he thinks he might be able to write his way out of his poverty. And that's the origin of his famous history of the Ottawa and Chippewa people. In the preface, he writes, "It seems desirable that the history of my people should not be lost, like that of other tribes who previously existed in their country and who have left no record of their ancient legends and their traditions." And the book does go ahead and fulfill that role to some extent. But it comes into being only because Andrew does have some good friends from his time at the Michigan Normal College in Ypsilanti. And one of those people is a woman by the name of Georgina Webb Owen. She's a member of a group called the Women's National Indian Association. It was founded back in 1879 to do two things: to ensure the United States government lived up to its treaty obligations, but also to bring Christian educational programs to Indians so they could be mainstreamed into U.S. society. And it is through her influence that money is raised to publish Andrew Blackbird's book. She wrote one of her fundraising letters. She wrote, "I do not know, but Blackbird and his family will starve or die of broken hearts if something can't be done to get out at least a pamphlet before June." So it really indicates that Andrew Blackbird was in pretty desperate straits. And in gratitude for Georgina Webb Owens' assistance in getting Andrew's book published, Andrew's sister, pictured here on the left of our slide, made a beautiful birch bark quill embroidered copy of Andrew's history, which was given to Ms. Owens. But that wasn't the limit of Andrew's writing. Once he started, he wrote a number of pamphlets. One of the important one was the Indian problem from the Indian standpoint. And the basic point that he makes here is a point that he made way back in the 1850s, that the future for Native people was through education. But that the boarding schools that are at Carlisle, for example, that were set up by the government, or even later the boarding school at Mount Pleasant in Michigan, these were schools that were designed to teach Native children manual arts, like becoming a saddle maker or a blacksmith, or Indian women were taught to embroider and to be cooks, to basically make them servants of white people. Andrew did not think that was appropriate. And like many educated Native people, he wanted to reform the Office of Indian Affairs. In Andrew's old age, situation just goes from bad to worse for the Odawa. Federal officials that travel through the area describe the Native people of northern Michigan essentially being treated the way African Americans were in the Jim Crow South. Andrew's life ends in 1908. Rather tragically, he dies at the Emmett County Poor Farm, which I couldn't find an illustration of, so this is the Ottawa County Poor Farm pictured here. His wife was still alive, and his two sons and his daughter were still alive. And so why they couldn't take care of Andrew Blackbird is unclear. Poverty seems to have been one problem, but it may have been that he was suffering from dementia as well. We don't know. It's one of those things that a biographer cannot find out. But for an Odawa man to be put out to pasture literally at this white man's poor farm is a sad commentary, because in traditional Odawa society, old people were respected and cared for by their family, and they lived in extended families. It was something that could never be imagined, really. So Andrew's tragic end in many ways is an example of some of the limits that America placed on Indian lives. Here was somebody who strived to go ahead and integrate into American society, achieved the educational skills, participated in government, but in the end is shunted aside. Odawa life continued very much on the margins throughout the remainder of the 19th and into the first half of the 20th century. But Christianity that Andrew Blackbird's father had brought to, and his uncle had brought to northern Michigan, played an important role in preserving the Odawa community. Those who were Methodists participated in Methodist camp meetings, were very important in creating community networks, as was the Catholic parish life in Harbor Springs. at Holy Childhood of Jesus Parish and the boarding school. Of course, we know the boarding school had a somewhat mixed legacy with some abuse taking place there for children. But by and large, Christianity became a vessel in which Native people could come together as Native people and then also adopt their traditions into the Christian calendar, such as ghost suppers going ahead and being coordinated with the Catholic All Souls Day. Significant change emerges, however, for Native America in Michigan in the post-World War II period, with the Indian Claims Commission offered by the federal government and the emergence of educated Native leaders like Robert Dominic and Juanita Dominic, bringing cases before the Indian Claims Commission, and then eventually in 1994 with the reestablishment of government-to-government relations between the Odawa and the United States government. In the 1970s, the successful prosecution of United States versus Michigan federal court case reestablished the rights of Odawa fishermen, the priority of Odawa fishermen in Great Lakes fishing. The movement to give Native peoples more sovereign control over their affairs that begins in the presidency of Richard Nixon eventually results in the establishment of tribal casinos and a new source of income for Native tribes. I don't have to tell you folks about the Andrew Blackbird Museum in Harbor Springs, where the story of Native Michigan is one of the places where it's told. But the story of Native people in northern Michigan and the story of Andrew Blackbird is a very different story than the one we normally hear about Native people. The history of Indians in America is too often told through the great war chiefs, through Sitting Bull, through Black Hawker, Tecumseh, Pontiac, Geronimo. But what did the war leaders achieve? In some cases, a temporary reversal of the settler colonial tide that was washing over Native America, but in almost all cases, it brought death, it brought starvation, and it brought the loss of land. Christianity and education that came after that have done much more to preserve Native American culture and identity. So we think about Andrew Blackbird's life, dying in the poor farm in Emmett County. One would think he's a failure, but in many ways, he pointed the way for the modern Odawa community today. In his 1900 pamphlet on the Indian problem from the Indian's perspective, he wrote, "In the face of great antipathy and prejudice, there is no remedy but to educate Indians and permit them in the halls of Congress to protect the rights of my beleaguered race. I pray to God that somebody will step in my footsteps and continue to sing the same war song until every inhabitant, including the government of the United States, would deign to listen to this war song." And so the importance of education was Andrew's song. And that prompted me to make that part of the title of this book about his life, some of just the bare outlines of which I shared with you today. And I thank you for the opportunity to do so.
All right. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And we do have a couple of questions that I'm hoping you will have some answers for. The first one is, and you did sort of answer this already, actually, but it was asked earlier in the presentation, why exactly Andrew Blackbird ended up a pauper. And also, that same individual wanted to know where Makeda Penese is buried, if you know that. And this person is the great granddaughter of Andrew Blackbird, and Makeda Penese is her third great grandfather.
My word. It's a privilege to go ahead and take a question from you for certain. Um, no, I don't have any idea where Makeda is buried. Um, uh, in his last years, Andrew built a home for him, a cabin for him, uh, and that was in what's today um, Harbor Springs. I have no idea where that is. Uh, how did Andrew become impoverished? Uh, he actually and his wife at one point actually operated a bit of a real estate agency. With his annuity monies, he bought a number of tracts of land, city lots inside what's now Harbor Springs, as well as plots of land in the Emmett County hinterland. Uh, but one by one, some of these were stolen from him. Others he lost for tax purposes, and others he had to sell just to go ahead and support the family. And so uh, by the time of his death, the family owns no land, not even his allotment under the 1855 treaty that I believe is on a golf course today, just south of Harbor Springs.
All right. Our next question we had was, what exactly was the Emmett County Poor Farm, and how did a person end up there?
So this was a benevolent agency that would have been created by the county board uh, in order to care for people so that you wouldn't have literally what we have today, street people. And so you could be sent to the poor farm if you were guilty of vagrancy, if the sheriff picked you up and, found you just, hanging out on the streets, you could be sent to the poor farm. If you were an able-bodied person, you worked at the poor farm. So you were there. It was a farm. They were raising crops because there was only so far benevolence went. And they didn't want this to be a money-losing operation. So the poor farm would actually produce agricultural products.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. A couple more questions here. This question is, you mentioned that Andrew was forced to leave the teacher's college and that he returned home with his wife. Why was he forced to leave, or did he just decide that he wanted to get married and choose to leave? What happened with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting. Uh, he describes to Reverend Bissell, who he's writing to all this time. There's this wonderful collection of letters from Andrew Blackbird to Samuel Bissell, his lifelong mentor, uh, at the Case Western or the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. And in the letters to Bissell, he describes his leaving as his father is sick and is asking for him to come home. And so that prompts him to leave. However, in the months before he leaves, Andrew has begun to give a series of lectures. He's given some lectures in Detroit, and he does another one. It's either in Ann Arbor or Lansing. I'm forgetting right now. And so I wonder if he begins to think that, maybe this could be a way for him to make some money, or not. I don't know.
Gotcha. We've got a couple more questions coming in here. Specifically, Cindy would like to know if there's any information that has been written about Margaret Boyd, Blackbird's sister, and if so, where one might find that information.
Okay, so there's a lot of scattered information about Margaret Boyd, and in fact, one could probably write a sketchy biography of her because she is documented in a lot of different places. Perhaps most usefully, in Andrew Blackbird's book, he talks about how during this time of troubles, when you've got these avaricious people flooding into Emmett County and trying to push out the Indians, he has a whole section where he talks about how she and her husband are forced to lose some of their land because some guy is claiming um, that a bull that they owned gored him, even though they didn't own a cow at all. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But in the records, Catholic Church records at the University of Notre Dame are the records of the Detroit Diocese. And there you'll find correspondence that talks a little bit about Margaret Boyd when she first went to become educated in Cincinnati. And then later when she comes back and works as a teacher at the Catholic school in Harbor Springs. And then, of course, there are a number of reminiscences of people who grew up in Harbor Springs that talk about her journey to Washington to meet President Grant. Oh, and then finally, there's a couple of good articles that are available that talk about her quill work. And she was quite artistic. If you Google Margaret Boyd, Harbor Springs, or Margaret Boyd, Odawa, I think you'll find some links.
And I believe it's the Grand Rapids Public Museum has some of Margaret Boyd's quill work in their collection and on display, actually. Let's see, another question. Patrick would like to know if you could more clearly describe the 1836 treaty boundaries. Wasn't all the land above the Manistee River or the Grand River ceded?
It was all the land above the Grand River along a certain line. So for example, the 1836 Treaty of Washington, there were two 1836 Treaties of Washington. And so in one of them, the area north of the Grand River in western Michigan was ceded by the Odawa and Ojibwa. Another 1836 Treaty of Washington was signed by the Saginaw and Black Creek Chippewa, or Ojibwa, and that was the area which roughly north of the Grand River, that on the eastern part of Michigan.
Perfect.
And again, if you Google 1836 Treaty of Washington, Michigan, you'll see as the illustration I had on the slide, which is the official United States government boundaries for that session.
Perfect. Let's see, Robert would like to know if you can expand on the importance of the 1994 development of the nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and the Odawa.
Yes.
And actually, this question might go along with that. What did Bill Clinton sign favoring the Odawa?
Okay. I don't know what Clinton signed per se, but there was a congressional authorization in 1994 to recognize the Little Traverse Band. And there had been a recognition somewhat. See, something I left out was there was a movement for Andrew Blackbird to be made the Indian agent for Michigan, to have a Native person be in charge of Native affairs in Michigan. This would have been revolutionary. And he had support of a fair number of people that he should get this post. But in the end, the lumber interests in Michigan went ahead and sidetracked this by putting into a congressional funding bill a phrase that basically ended the Michigan Indian Agency. And as far as the government in Washington was concerned, from that point on, they said there was no government to government relations with the Odawa or the Ojibwa in Michigan. Well, that was a violation of the treaty because the 1855 treaty had never been fully carried out. So it was actually illegal for what the government did. And so in the 1970s onward, the United States got, with Richard Nixon in 1974 really revolutionizes American Indian relations. And he creates the new, what we call the sovereignty movement. Let's respect the sovereignty of Native peoples. And from that point on, the government gradually renews government to government relations with the Odawa, which is finally officially recognized in 1994.
I believe that that was actually our last question. Stay safe out there, and hopefully we'll see you at our next lecture. Goodbye, everyone.